My name is Julia, and I will never forget that Christmas. It was supposed to be ordinary, even pleasant. A trip to visit my parents, a festive dinner, and late-night conversations. But everything went wrong. The day started normally. I finished the last-minute shopping, carefully wrapped the gifts, and planned to leave for my parents' house in the afternoon. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, about 2 hours away. I left around 3 p.m., and everything seemed fine. Light snow had just begun to fall, the road was nearly empty, and Christmas songs played softly on the car radio. About half an hour into the drive, I noticed a car following me. It was an old, rusty sedan that stayed uncomfortably close. I slowed down to let it pass, but it didn't. That felt strange, but I tried not to dwell on it. Maybe they're just in a hurry to get home for the holidays, I thought. After a while, I turned onto a poorly lit rural road that led to my parents' house. The sedan followed. The streets in this area were dimly lit, and the snowfall was getting heavier. I could feel the tension rising. Why is it still following me? That was the first real warning sign. To test my theory, I made a deliberate wrong turn. The car behind mimicked my maneuver. That couldn't be a coincidence. At that point, I was on the verge of panic. I sped up and tried calling my parents, but of course, there was no signal. When I finally saw the sign for their street, I felt some relief. My parents' house was just a few blocks away. I thought, if I can get to their house, I'll be safe. But suddenly, the car's headlights disappeared. The sedan had turned off somewhere else. That felt odd, but I breathed a sigh of relief. I turned onto their street and parked at the curb. The neighborhood was quiet and dark, with only the glow of Christmas lights decorating the houses providing some comfort. I got out of the car with the gift bags in my hands and started walking toward my parents' door. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw a figure standing under the streetlight. It was a man in a long jacket and hood, his face hidden in shadows. "Are you looking for something?" I asked, trying to sound confident. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward. My heart pounded faster, and the bag slipped from my hands. "Leave!" I shouted, starting to back away toward the door. He kept coming closer. My hand fumbled in my pocket for the keys, but my shaking fingers made it hard to unlock the door. "Is that you?" My mother's voice called from behind the door. A lifeline. The door opened, and I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. "What happened?" my mother asked, noticing my pale face. I told her about the car and the man. We looked out the window, but no one was there. She suggested I might just be tired and needed to calm down. But that night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to every sound. Then, around midnight, I heard a faint tapping on the window. I froze. The window was on the second floor. I slowly got out of bed, walked to the curtain, and peeked through it. There, in the darkness, was his face. He was staring right at me, his unblinking eyes fixed on mine. He raised a finger to his lips, as if to say, "Be quiet." I screamed. Seconds later, my parents burst into the room, but by then, he was gone. They tried to convince me it was my imagination, brought on by stress. But the next morning, when we went outside, there were clear footprints in the snow beneath the window. This wasn't just in my head. I left for home a few days later, but ever since that Christmas, the memory of that man haunts me. Sometimes I think I see him in a crowd. Sometimes I hear footsteps behind me. And every time I wonder, what if, next time, he catches up with me? Every Christmas, I spent the holidays at my grandmother's old house on the outskirts of town. It had been a tradition since childhood. The scent of pine, vanilla cookies, and the crackling of firewood in the hearth. But that Christmas is not remembered for its warmth and coziness. It's remembered for something I still cannot explain. I arrived late on Christmas Eve. Snow was falling in large flakes, blanketing the roads, and my car barely made it up to the driveway. Grandma greeted me at the door, as she always did, with a warm smile and a mug of hot cocoa. She looked a bit tired, but was still bustling around the kitchen with her usual energy. We had dinner by candlelight, laughing and reminiscing about childhood. And then, out of nowhere, Grandma said, "I heard it last night. The ringing. I think he's back." "Who?" I asked, not quite understanding her words. She gave me a strange look, as though surprised I didn't remember. "The ringing. When your Uncle Ben disappeared." A chill ran down my spine. Ben, her youngest son, had gone missing many years ago, on Christmas Eve no less. His disappearance had always been shrouded in silence and mystery, but I had never dared to ask. Grandma continued, "It's a faint ringing, like a bell, but you can't tell where it's coming from. It's everywhere and nowhere." I brushed it off, thinking it was just her age and memories playing tricks on her. We said goodnight, and I went to the guest room. Everything was as it had always been, a blanket with reindeer patterns, an antique wardrobe, and the old wall clock chiming every hour. I woke around 3 a.m. with an unsettling feeling. The room was unnaturally cold despite the heater running. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible ringing. It seemed too distant to pinpoint its source. I decided to check if everything was all right and stepped out into the hallway. The house was utterly silent. I peeked into Grandma's room. She was asleep, her breathing steady. But the ringing persisted. It grew louder the further I walked, as if guiding me toward the antique wardrobe in the corridor. That wardrobe was a family heirloom. No one ever touched it. Grandma always said it had belonged to her great-grandmother. I couldn't explain why, but my hands moved toward its doors on their own. They creaked open softly. Inside, nothing. Just an old coat hanger swaying silently, yet the ringing became deafening. Then I noticed something I'd never seen before. Scratches on the inside of the door. Words. "I'm here. Find me." At that moment the ringing stopped abruptly, and I felt someone behind me. I turned around. Grandma was standing in the hallway doorway. Her eyes were wide, staring at me. "Did you see him?" she whispered. I didn't respond. I just stood there, stunned and terrified. The next morning, I tried to open the wardrobe again, but it was just an ordinary piece of furniture. The scratches and the ringing were gone. Only the suffocating feeling remained, that something or someone had tried to reach out to me. The following day, Grandma told me that the year Ben disappeared, she had heard the ringing too, but had been too afraid to investigate. I don't know what it was, but every time I hear bells on Christmas night I shiver, because I never went back to that house. My name is Lily. I work in the city, and my commute home always takes about 3 hours. That year it started snowing earlier than usual, and the roads weren't the best. I stayed late at work trying to get everything finished before the vacations and ended up leaving late. My dad called, reminding me that the promised snowfall might prevent me from getting there on time. "Lily, if it gets too bad, stop at a motel," he said. But I decided to drive. The road was deserted, the snow-covered fields and gloomy forests creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. But something about the silence bothered me. About halfway down the road, I noticed a lone figure on the side of the road. It was a man dressed in an old jacket and hat. He stood motionless with his arms wrapped around a large box. His face was covered by a scarf. When my headlights illuminated him, he raised his hand as if asking me to stop. I'm not sure what exactly prompted me to slow down. Perhaps guilt that I would leave him alone on such a cold night. I rolled the window down a little so he could speak. "Please, can you give me a ride?" His voice was quiet, almost pleading. "I'm not interrupting anything. Just need to get this in before midnight." His words sounded strange. I looked at the box in his hands. It was wrapped in dark paper with a silver ribbon. I didn't know what to say, but something in his gaze made me nod. He sat down in the back seat, carefully placing the box on his lap. I felt the temperature in the car drop, even though the heater was on full blast. "Where do you want to go?" I asked. "To the end of the road," he answered, keeping his eyes on the box. We drove in silence. The man hardly moved, and it was tense. I tried to speak to lighten the atmosphere. "Do you have a gift for someone special?" I asked, pointing to the box. He lifted his head slightly, and I noticed his eyes glinting in the dashboard light. "Yes, it's very important." His tone was so serious that it made me uncomfortable. When we came to a fork in the road, he asked me to stop. I glanced at my watch. It was 15 to midnight. The man got out, and I could see his feet sinking into the snow. He turned to me, and before closing the door, he said, "Thank you. Now you have to leave. Immediately." "Wait, where are you going?" I asked. But he was already moving toward the woods. The box in his hand seemed heavy, but he carried it with a strange lightness. At that moment I heard laughter, a child's laughter, thin and tinkling, came from the darkness of the forest. It wasn't believable. No one could be there. I tried to call out to him again, but he disappeared into the shroud of snow. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to take his advice. I turned the car around and drove away, but the feeling that I had left something important behind never left me. The next morning, I told my parents about the strange hitchhiker. They looked at me with growing alarm. My mother, turning pale, whispered, "Lily, you have to see this." She brought out an old newspaper clipping. It told of a tragedy that had happened exactly 10 years ago at that very crossroads. A man was carrying a gift for his daughter, but their car went off the road. They both died. The only thing rescuers found at the scene was a box wrapped in dark paper with a silver ribbon. Since then, I don't drive alone at Christmas anymore. Sometimes I think about what was inside the box, but something tells me I don't want to know the answer.